What if a child that wasn't yours was your only chance to prove that you never committed the crime that destroyed your life? Imagine waking up one day and realizing that everything you knew, your freedom, your dignity, your very identity, has been ripped away from you with a single sentence, a single accusation. This is how Diego Oliveira's nightmare began. An ordinary, hard-working man with no prior record, who had his life turned into hell when his ex-girlfriend, months after their troubled breakup, accused him of rape. The complaint was accompanied by a revelation. She said she was pregnant and stated that the child was the result of that alleged crime. And, for justice, that was enough. No physical evidence, no expert reports, no witnesses. Just her word. And based solely on this narrative, Diego was preventively arrested. As the world around him crumbled, Diego tried to understand how everything had turned upside down. His friends disappeared, his family went into shock, and the media wasted no time in turning him into a villain. Headlines like, "ET technician is accused of rape," appeared on websites and local newspapers, and the trials on social media came even before the official hearing. During the trial, the central point of the accusation was not an examination, an expert opinion, or any concrete evidence. It was the son. The prosecution claimed that the existence of the child was irrefutable proof of the crime, and even without a DNA test carried out, the judge accepted this version. The defense pleaded for the examination to be carried out before sentencing, but the request was denied. Diego was sentenced to 22 years in prison. Can you imagine what it's like to be sentenced to the total forfeiture of your life based on an assumption? The truth, the one that should be the foundation of justice, was left aside. Diego was locked away like a monster, treated like a predator. Inside prison, he was the target of attacks, threats, and contempt. But there was something inside him that never went away, the certainty of his innocence. And no matter how much the system had failed him, Diego believed that one day the truth would come out. What he didn't know was that this truth was hidden precisely in what they used against him, the child. A DNA test ignored for years could change everything. And this is where our story begins to take on another shape, a shape you will never forget. Because the burning question is, how many other Diegos are living? This same nightmare now, while the silence of justice continues to claim invisible victims. If this story has touched you in any way, if at any point you felt angry, sad, or angry, then be part of this fight for justice. Leave your like now and subscribe to the channel, because every time you do this, more people have the chance to learn about these stories that the system would prefer to keep buried. Your voice helps spread truths the world needs to hear. And this is just the first piece of a much bigger puzzle. Diego Oliveira never imagined that his ordinary routine would be destroyed by an accusation capable of erasing his identity and forever tarnishing his existence. Computer technician, 29 years old, dedicated worker, no prior record, no involvement with crime. He was known in the neighborhood as someone who was quiet, kind, always willing to help. The kind of person everyone greets on the street, but almost no one really knows. His relationship with Anna, although marked by back and forth, exaggerated jealousy, and a certain emotional imbalance, had never gone beyond the limits of a common couple's discussion. Until, after a messy separation, everything changed. Diego moved on, trying to rebuild his life, while Anna disappeared for a while, only to reappear months later with a devastating accusation that turned her reality upside down. The complaint fell like a bomb. Anna claimed that she had been raped by Diego and that, as a result, she had become pregnant. In shock, Diego immediately denied everything. He said that the accusation was absurd, that he would never do something like that to anyone, much less to someone with whom he had already shared such intimate moments. But his words carried no weight. Nobody wanted to listen. The police treated him as guilty from the first minute. There was no immediate forensic examination. There was no genetic examination. There was no real investigation. Just handcuffs, sensational headlines, and looks of disgust. Her word was treated as absolute truth, and his as a calculated lie. From one day to the next, Diego stopped being an ordinary citizen and became a monster in the eyes of society. The clean record, the character, the friends, the past didn't matter. One accusation was enough for everything to collapse. The local news portrayed his face as that of a cold criminal. Social media exploded with judgments without proof. Co-workers walked away. The neighborhood began to treat him with contempt. Diego's mother had to change neighborhood after threats. The mere mention of his name caused revolt, indignation, hatred, and in the midst of all this, no one questioned the obvious. Where was the evidence? Where was the promised DNA test? Why hadn't such a simple test been required from the beginning? The answer was frightening and revealing. The system didn't want truth. It just wanted someone to blame. And Diego, because he was ordinary, vulnerable, and unable to defend himself against the weight of the judicial machine, was the perfect target. He was thrown into an abyss of silence and abandonment, with no chance to explain, no room to breathe. And while everyone was pointing the finger, a single truth remained suffocated. He was innocent. But no one wanted to know that. A few months after the turbulent end of the relationship, Diego was still trying to pick up the pieces of a life torn apart by the constant fights and emotional humiliations he had endured alongside Ana. But nothing prepared him for the blow that would follow. An ordinary morning was interrupted by an unexpected call. Ana, now pregnant, formally accused him of rape. The news paralyzed him. This was more than absurd. It was cruel. According to her, the pregnancy was the result of a sexual assault that had occurred after the separation, in an alleged visit in which Diego had invaded her home. But Diego was never there that day. There was evidence, records, messages. None of that mattered. The complaint fell into the hands of a system thirsty for quick responses, for numbers of arrests, for results that would please public opinion. And once again, justice became a spectacle. The narrative was perfect in the eyes of the media. A rejected, spiteful ex-boyfriend who did not accept the end and committed a barbaric crime. But it was all a lie. The emotional impact of pregnancy was used as a weapon of persuasion. The prosecution constructed the image of a vulnerable woman, alone, who carried the consequences of a trauma in her womb, and that was enough for the case to take on an almost cinematic shape. There were no reports. There was no conclusive medical examination. There was not even a DNA test carried out. Even so, Diego was preventively arrested on the same day that the complaint was formalized. Cold handcuffs, a stuffy police car, and looks of disgust from police officers who already thought he was guilty. Nobody asked your version. No one questioned the absence of physical evidence. The headlines came out before the interrogation even began. Man arrested for raping ex and getting her pregnant. Public opinion didn't want justice, it wanted blood. And he became the perfect face to represent the collective anger against heinous crimes, even if he had never committed one. Diego tried to argue, beg, explain. He said he had never been to Ana's house that day, that they had messages proving that they hadn't spoken to each other in weeks, but it was no use. The weight of the accusation was greater than any truth. It was a war he didn't know how to fight, and for which no one gave him weapons. The public defender, overwhelmed, did not even have time to review the process. The judge ordered the arrest as a preventive measure to protect the victim and the baby. A baby that hadn't even undergone a paternity test. A crime without proof, with a single witness, and an entire life being destroyed by a judicial error that grew by the minute. Diego was thrown into the system as the culprit, with no chance of defense, no chance of survival. He entered that prison as just another number. But behind bars, he was a man broken by the most brutal injustice. being accused of a crime he never committed, and being silenced by the truth that no one wanted to hear. The courtroom was packed, not just from people, but from looks that already carried a verdict before the first word was even spoken. It was as if Diego was just there to fulfill a role, that of the villain, the monster, the merciless aggressor, and not to seek justice. The prosecution knew exactly how to manipulate the narrative, and he did it masterfully. Anna's son was presented to the jury as the strongest evidence, not for science, but for emotion. A baby in the arms of a crying woman. That image alone was more powerful than any examination, more definitive than any argument. The prosecutor didn't have to try very hard. All he had to do was point to the child and say, "She would never use that as a lie. No one would use their own child to invent a crime." The room fell silent, not out of respect, but out of acceptance. At that moment, the truth was no longer relevant. The show was already underway. The defense, no matter how much it tried to react, was treated as a nuisance, as if each request to carry out a DNA test was an affront to the alleged victim's pain. "The child is living proof," repeated the prosecutor with conviction. But it wasn't, and Diego knew that. He knew that child was not his. He was absolutely sure. But I couldn't shout that truth because no one was listening. The formal request for a paternity test was made on the second day of the trial. The judge, impassive, rejected it on the basis of irrelevance to the facts presented. He claimed that DNA was not necessary, as there was already sufficient conviction. That word, conviction, echoed in Diego's ears like a hammer, the same one that would fall days later to declare its ruin. Throughout the hearing, Diego was just a frozen image of contained pain. Sitting among his lawyers, with his hands shaking and his eyes fixed on the floor, he listened to each sentence as if they were blades. The prosecution painted him as manipulative, cold, vindictive, someone capable of using their proximity to attack. The defense, weakened without evidence, without expertise, without support from public opinion, tried to react with fragile arguments in the face of an emotionally destructive narrative, and the jury, made up of ordinary people, could not resist the force of the commotion. On the last day, when the prosecutor ended his speech by saying, "This child's pain will carry the echo of the crime for the rest of his life," Diego's fate was already sealed. The sentence was read in a serious tone, as if it were a relief for everyone. 22 years in prison. Diego didn't cry. He didn't even try to protest, because deep down, he knew that nothing he said would be bigger than what had just happened. The truth was ignored, science was discarded, and justice became a play where the plot was already written even before the first act. And in the center of that stage, an innocent man was condemned for the only thing that could have proven his freedom, a son that wasn't his. Behind bars, Diego wasn't just another number in the system, he was a living target. The cold, damp cell was not as suffocating as the label he carried, rapist. That word, which accompanied him like an invisible sentence, was enough to turn him into enemy number one inside the prison. His story, his truth, his innocence didn't matter. Inside, justice was revenge, and he, in the eyes of the other inmates, deserved every second of pain. In the first month, he was beaten 3 times. I was beaten in the cafeteria, in the shower, in narrow corridors where there were no cameras. Guards watched in silence. Some even smiled. He was the monster of the time, and monsters, in that world, had no right to breathe in peace. Time passed, but the pain never eased. The isolation wasn't just physical, it was emotional, psychological, crushing. The family, embarrassed, slowly moved away. Visits stopped happening, letters stopped arriving, friends disappeared like leaves in the wind, taking with them any memory of a previous life. Diego, who before was surrounded by voices, laughter, conversations, now spoke only with the echo of his own thoughts. The nights were long, endless, and the silence of the early morning was filled with the screams of other broken men and the whispers of doubt, Not about his innocence, but about how long he could hold out without going crazy. 7 years. 7 years of being treated like scum. 7 years trying not to lose my sanity. 7 years of eating the same moldy bread, sleeping with one eye open, counting the days on a scratched wall until there was no more room for scratches. At many moments, he thought about giving up. But every time he came close to that abyss, he clung to a single truth. He was innocent. And as long as he knew that, he wouldn't allow the system to completely erase who he was. Therefore, in the midst of loneliness, he began to write. Not to be read, but not to be forgotten. I wrote down every detail of the process, every flaw, every injustice. He wrote as if one day someone would read it, as if somehow those words were his last hope of surviving oblivion. Because what hurt most was not the cell, the blows, or the contempt. It was being buried alive for a lie. Diego was not just condemned by the courts, he was erased by society. Nobody wanted to know his version. No one asked if there was proof. All it took was one accusation, a son that wasn't his, and he was thrown to the bottom of a well that seemed to have no end. But even crushed, even broken, he still breathed. I still believed that one day someone would see what everyone refused to see, because deep down, the truth doesn't disappear, it waits. And Diego's was just waiting to be heard. If this story touched you in any way, tell me. How long could you stand being unfairly accused without anyone listening to you? Right here in the comments, the truth doesn't scream, it resists. If you believe that cases like this need to be told, remembered, shared, your comment could be the strength this story needs to reach more people, and perhaps awaken someone who still believes that the system never fails. It was on the 8th winter inside the cell that a spark of hope once again crossed the walls that surrounded Diego. An NGO working to review unfair sentences received an anonymous complaint about his case. A young lawyer, newly arrived at the team and driven by an almost naive sense of justice, decided to review every detail of that process. And the more she read, the more absurd the conviction seemed. How could someone have been arrested for rape based solely on an accusation, without an expert report, without witnesses, without even a DNA test? She knew something was wrong. Her first action was simple: officially request a paternity test that had never been done. The court's response came with coldness and disdain, irrelevant after conviction, but she didn't accept it. He pressed again, went to the press, wrote articles, filed petitions, and knocked on the doors of judges who still had shame on their faces. The slow and insensitive bureaucracy tried to silence the truth once again. But for the first time in almost a decade, someone didn't give up on Diego. And when the exam was finally authorized, even under resistance, no one imagined what that piece of paper would reveal. The chance for justice, so long buried, was about to resurface, and with it, the beginning of the end of a lie that destroyed an entire life. When the sealed envelope reached the lawyer's hands, the air seemed heavy inside the stuffy room of the penitentiary. She took a deep breath before opening the document, knowing that that piece of paper could be the only key to freeing a man who had already been buried alive by justice. She read it once, twice, 3 times to make sure she wasn't making a mistake. Result: incompatible. Diego was not the child's father. That result was more than a scientific discovery. It was a silent scream, stifled for 7 years, that finally broke the walls of silence. If Diego wasn't the father, then he could never have been the rapist. The entire prosecution, built like a sandcastle on the emotion of a hasty trial, was beginning to crumble. When the report was attached to the file and sent to the prosecutor's office, the first reaction was not to admit the error, but to minimize it. One test does not erase everything else. But what remains? There was never any evidence, there was never a serious investigation. Everything was always based on a single version, and now that version was officially dismantled. The truth, buried for so long, finally emerged. raw, implacable. And even if the system resisted, even if many still pretended not to see it, DNA spoke louder. An innocent man had been arrested, and now there was no hiding it anymore. News of the result began as a whisper among the stuffy corridors of the public defender's office, but soon spread like wildfire. The report, clear as daylight, made it clear. Diego was not the child's father, and therefore he could not have committed the crime for which he was convicted. But what should have been? The immediate beginning of his liberation turned into a new chapter of blind resistance by the system. The prosecution, instead of acknowledging the error, tried to divert the focus. They argued that DNA did not erase the victim's suffering, that the fact that the boy was not Diego's son did not completely rule out the possibility of violence. The narrative was now supported by assumptions and no longer by evidence. The defense, armed with the result and a new legal team, filed a request for criminal review, demanding the immediate annulment of the sentence. Alternative media started reporting, and society, previously indifferent, began to wake up. The headlines changed tone from convicted rapist to possible serious miscarriage of justice. The debate reached social media, and people were divided between those who called for immediate justice and those who, intoxicated by years of misinformation, still judged based on old headlines. But what no one could ignore was the unquestionable strength of DNA, irrefutable scientific proof that screamed the innocence of a man who spent years watching his life be destroyed. It was the beginning of the turning point, but the road to freedom would still be tortuous, because when the truth threatens the reputation of the system itself, it becomes everyone's greatest enemy. If you've come this far and felt, even for a second, the pain of someone being buried alive for a mistake that could have been avoided with a simple examination, then I need to know, do you believe that a system that resists the truth deserves to remain unpunished? Comment below, DNA is justice, if you think that every innocent person deserves to be heard before being judged. Your voice may be small alone, but together with others, it can echo louder than any imposed silence. When the penitentiary gates finally opened, there was no applause, cameras, or reunion hugs. Diego crossed the line between concrete and freedom with the same bitter silence that accompanied him for 8 years. No one was waiting for him outside. No authority handed him an apology. No financial compensation. No headlines corrected the error. He simply left with an older body, his eyes full of a screaming past, and his heart crushed by indifference. Anna, the woman whose lie destroyed her life, remained free, unpunished, protected by the lack of evidence against her false accusation. The child, who was used as a symbol of a devastating lie, grew up in another city, unaware that he had been the key to, and also the prison of, an innocent man. Diego tried to rebuild his life, but the label preceded him. The word rapist still echoed in his back when he passed on the street. Many did not care about the new report, for society, once convicted, always condemned. And this pain, invisible but constant, was perhaps worse than the years in a cell, because now he could breathe, but he still wasn't truly free. Diego walked the streets like a man, without an identity, even with his pockets carrying a document of innocence. Every attempt to start over was met with doors that closed without explanation, looks that crossed him with suspicion, resumes ignored, fake smiles in interviews that ended with, "We'll let you know later." The stigma was stronger than any certificate of freedom. Living in favor, eating what they donated, emotionally supported by an NGO that believed in him when no one else wanted to listen, Diego slowly sank into a silence more cruel than that of prison. He developed insomnia, fear of crowds, and increasingly constant panic attacks. The man who used to smile easily could now barely look the person who approached him in the eye. In a rare interview, his choked voice carried the pain that words could not convey. "I was condemned for what I didn't do, and forgotten when the truth came out." This sentence, said with a tight throat and teary eyes, spread across the networks like a choked cry from everyone who has ever been crushed by the system. But for Diego, none of that was consolation, because the real prison, the one where he still lived, didn't have iron bars. I had memories, and these can't be opened with any key. And the most painful thing for Diego was not just everything that was taken from him, but the fact that everything could have been avoided with a simple test, an analysis that would take less than a week. A DNA test, cheap, accessible, objective, would have prevented years of pain, violence, and emotional destruction. But the system chose to ignore it. He preferred to judge quickly, silence doubts, punish to satisfy public opinion. There was no time for truth, but there was haste for condemnation. And now, even with the evidence out in the open, the battle for justice continues to drag on, cold, indifferent. The action filed against the state moves slowly through the bureaucratic corridors of a judiciary that pretends not to see the weight of what it has done. With each new appeal, with each new postponed hearing, it becomes clear. It is not justice, it is contempt. And this slowness doesn't fix anything, it just prolongs the pain. Because delayed justice, when it arrives, no longer heals. It only serves as a reminder that the system it is supposed to protect is the same one it destroys. Diego walks the streets today as a free man on paper, but invisible in reality. You carry in your eyes the weight of an injustice that time has not erased, and in your heart, the doubt that will never be answered. What would your life have been like if you had simply done what was right from the beginning? His story is not his alone. It echoes in every cell occupied by someone who claims innocence, in every rushed trial, in every sentence dictated under pressure and without concrete evidence. How many Diegos are there now, at this very moment, forgotten in prisons, judged by hearsay, buried by a system that still prefers to condemn rather than investigate? How many truths were ignored for convenience? And how many mistakes like this could be avoided if DNA testing were the rule, not the exception? Diego's pain is not just personal, it is collective. It is the reflection of a system that still fails where it should be more precise. And as long as nothing is done to change, more Diegos will continue to be crushed in silence while the world simply watches. If this story touched you, if at any point you felt indignation, impotence, or even fear of one day experiencing something similar, then you know how important it is for more people to listen to voices like Diego's. Leave your like and subscribe to the channel now, because each new video is one more step so that injustices like this are never ignored again. And if you think you've seen it all, wait until you find out what came next. The truth is sometimes even more disturbing than the lie.